Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Today, I'm joined by our co-host and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. We're going to be talking about the Rockets. As we're recording this Thursday morning, they're coming off a very forgettable loss in New Orleans, dropped them to 10-28 on the season. They are going to play again tonight at home against the Utah Jazz, part two of a back-to-back. So we're going to be talking a bit about the micro of recent games, which has not been pretty. The Rockets have now lost 10 of their last 11 games in 5 straight as we're recording this podcast. Hopefully they win tonight, but even if they do, it's not going to dramatically change the narrative. So we're going to be talking a bit more about the macro because tonight is game 39 and then Sunday is game 40. That's the 2 games of this homestand, and we're rapidly approaching the midway point of the 82-game season. Rockets are 10-28, identical to where they are a year ago, which I think is not the progress that a lot of fans wanted to see from this young group, not individually and not collectively as well. So Paulo, let's jump right in and start there. As we're approaching the midway point, there's a lot of angst really about just so many things with this team. The coaching, certain players not developing as fans would like. There's some concern with the front office as well. As we're approaching the halfway point, what are some of the things that you're looking at with this team from a macro perspective? What's the key theme that you're looking at from the first half of this season that you really want to get rectified as they look at the second half coming up?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me is it looks like we're on a downswing rather than it feels like it's getting worse game by game rather than better game by game. Whether that is because some guys are playing better and others are playing worse. It just feels like, you like to mention the rod of losing is settling in a little bit more. And even, there's various ways of losing a game, and the ways we're losing our games has been even worse than usual. But I guess what I'll pick up on first will actually be just defensively, the effort is not there. Accountability is not there. Whether that is individual effort, barring the usual few, Jabari Smith still tries, Tari Eason still tries, right? But for most of the players, it's just not there. And it feels a little bit like it's a combination of schemes and a combination of just people pulling in different directions. So it doesn't feel like the team has a common goal or they're all, rowing the same way. For example, I think Eric Gordon doesn't. We'll get into Eric Gordon later, but I think Eric Gordon doesn't seem to want to be here. He's just not trying, even offensively. He's, just taking whatever shots come to him. He's not even. Eric Gordon's always taken deep, catch and shoot jump shots, but it feels like they're deeper than usual, and it feels like they're being taken in situations where they were really not the best shot. And so we're getting into the defensive part, which I think is more important. I talked about the effort, but even just schematically, there were back-to-back possessions last night that I can remember clear in my head where we help like one pass away, for example. Mm-hmm. And we don't, usually when you help one pass away, it's because you're trying to contain the drive, you're trying to contain the dribble penetration, right? We're not achieving that, and at the same time, we're leaving the shooter one pass away open. It's like we're playing a bit of a zone, but the zone isn't. The purpose of the zone is to stop penetration. That's why you give extra space for shooters. We are running the zone, allowing dribble penetration still, and it feels like we beat ourselves defensively from a scheme standpoint. Although I'm sure probably the players aren't executing it to the maximum of their ability. But it feels like we almost beat ourselves. It's so easy to get this team to scramble mode. We help on everything, and then since we help from one pass away, we're constantly scrambling, late closeouts, just getting beat on a closeout to the rim. It's just a mess, and it has not been getting better as time has gone on. It feels like players are getting less and less bought in, and accountability seems to be a real issue. So just, the feeling that we're supposed to get better over time, and it actually feels like we might just somehow be getting worse is very damning, especially because it's very easy on a rebuilding team. And as the rebuild, accumulates more and more years, it's very easy to let it spiral out of control and just develop that losing culture that everybody talks about. You don't develop losing culture in 1 year or 2 years of tanking, but once you start getting a lot past that, and if you don't, especially if you don't see improvement, that's when it starts to get worrying, and that's when, we talk about the treadmill of mediocrity. There's an even worse, not even worse treadmill, but there's another treadmill, which is the treadmill of just being bad and just caring about offense. And even so, the offense is not really that good enough for us to be caring that much about it, and just, taking possessions off and not trying that hard on defense.
Let me ask you about the Pelicans game, because, of course, the Rockets fell down by 31 points in the first half. Really, it was uncompetitive from the opening tip-off. Silas got ejected, and they were down 20-plus at the end of the first quarter, arguing with officiating. And they actually did cut it to as low as 7 points, seemed to play a lot harder for John Lucas. I also thought when John Lucas was the interim coach for the Milwaukee game, that was one of their best defensive efforts of the season. Do you buy the idea that for whatever reason, maybe it's Lucas's willingness to be the bad cop? That's an analogy that he made to Jackson Gatlin this season. Do you buy the idea that maybe some of these guys play harder for John Lucas, or is it something like maybe Lucas is just more willing to take the guys out that aren't playing hard? Or is it just a matter of sample size? What do you make of this, small sample trend that the defensive effort does seem to pick up a bit when Lucas is the guy leading the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does pick up when Lucas is the guy. And if for nothing else, it might just be just from a personality standpoint. Like, these guys, they are prideful, and nobody wants to see like John Lucas was all over the place last night on the bench. He was jumping, he was stomping on the ground, he was yelling at everyone. That kind of attitude, just from a human perspective, right? Of course, you're not going to change someone's the team defensive identity just by being really loud, but just from a human perspective, that does demand more out of you. And something I've always struggled with watching NBA games is, well, these guys watch the film afterwards. How are you not embarrassed watching the film afterwards when you're playing like really poor defense and you're the reason the team's constantly getting beat? We don't have one reason on this team. We have many reasons. But how do you not feel like you're the one letting other people down? And I think John Lucas does hold them accountable more. There was a tweet, and of course, this is not reporting, right? It was apparently a fan that was at the arena that said that Jabari Smith Jr. just yelled at John Lucas to take his ass out, and that's the quote, in reference to Alperen Sengun after the defensive possession, right?
And we should note, by the way, that Bruno Fernando came in very early in the third quarter, right around the same time the tweet was issued at 8:30 p.m., which was right around when Sengun went out 3 minutes into the third quarter. So we haven't verified it, but it certainly seems plausible.
Yeah, it seems plausible, and it's not just that Jabari is holding other people accountable. It's, do we think Jabari Smith would have done the same thing had Stephen Silas been on the bench?
Yeah,
who knows? Question. It's a good question, because maybe they have more faith that, and this is projecting, okay, I don't know anything, but maybe they have more faith that John Lucas would do something about it if he saw a guy playing poorly on defense. It's one of those things where if it keeps happening and you see that there's not real repercussions for it, then you kind of give up yourself a little bit. So I do think that there's some validity to it. We need to see more games, but that does bring up an interesting point, because John Lucas is probably the prime candidate to be an interim should Stephen Silas get fired. And I'm mentioning this not just out of the blue. Earlier in the week, I think ESPN 975, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. I'm not from Houston.
Yes,
Yeah,
and Lance
97.5.
Zierlein and John Granado, for those who don't know them, those are sports talk radio institutions in Houston. They are well connected. And yeah, they clipped about a minute from their show and it went viral. So I know where you're getting at. I just wanted to give some background on Granado and Lance. They're definitely reputable people that have been in this market doing sports media for 20 plus years here. So they do not say things lightly.
Yeah, and so if they're mentioning it, right, it kind of brings up the question of if that happens and John Lucas is the replacement,
Yeah. And for
then
clarity,
we'll
both
get to see more of this, right?
Yes, both Lance and Granado agreed that Lucas would be the coach by February 1st. They were giving their opinion, but of course, I'm sure their opinion does have some nuggets of intel baked into it. That's sort of how the sports talk radio machine works. But yes, very interesting. As the background for anyone who has not seen the clip, both Lance and John predicted that John Lucas would be the Rockets head coach by February 1st, which is, of course, less than a month from now. Sorry for cutting you off. Just wanted to give the
No, you're
background there.
good. No, yeah, you made a good job of just laying it out completely. And so I think he does bring accountability to this team, which is something that they've been lacking. As I said, we're on a downward trend when it comes to defensive effort. What I do think is that accountability needs to come with some extra steps. For example, it doesn't mean much if it means something, but it doesn't mean much if John Lucas is now the head coach or the interim head coach, and he's trying to hold more people accountable, and then you have another one of the more powerful locker room voices in Eric Gordon, and he's just. I mean, we can get into talking about him a little bit because I think he's one of the things that we need to review the first half of the season on and what to do moving forward, because he just seems completely disconnected. As I said, both on defense and on offense, he'll play like decent on-ball defense. We know he's capable of better because he's shown us better, but he doesn't seem to care as much. Eric Gordon would have been a good rebounder, but nowadays it's really like pops out of the screen that balls are literally flying right by him and he's not going after them. On offense, he's not moving without the ball, right? He's a floor spacer, I understand that, but you can create more chaos offensively by just moving, right? Just have some urgency. Cutting has never been something Eric Gordon does a lot, but he doesn't cut either. And even his floor spacing nowadays just looks kind of lackadaisical to some extent. It's like he's always spaced back out to way beyond the 3-point line, but it feels even deeper than usual. And it feels like sometimes he catches the ball and he has a lot of space. He could like attack a closeout. He could just step a couple of steps forward and not shoot from the literal logo. And he just doesn't. It's just like, okay, I don't care enough to get a better shot than this. Let me just shoot this. And sometimes it goes in because it's Eric Gordon. But it just seems like he's not there mentally. And then when you add on to that the fact that he had that interview last week saying that there was no progress, and then Steven Silas later said, Steven Silas is a peacemaker, so what else would you expect him to say? But he said he sat down with him and then he understood where he was coming from. But even for Steven Silas to say that he doesn't agree with the way it was done, with the way it was said, I think that's noteworthy as well from Silas, who is someone who's just friendly and a peacemaker just in general. So I guess I'll flip the question back to you. When it comes to Eric Gordon, moving forward, what do you think that they should do with him? Because there's different things you can do. You could extend him, you could just guarantee his last year and maybe that makes him happier. You could trade him, you could just diminish his role. How are you feeling about Eric Gordon?
I think the simplest thing is just a trade. I know there's the option to potentially give him an extension at a lower average annual value than the $20 million he would make next year if they just picked up what's effectively a team option. But I just think that one way or another, the team is obviously going to have to address that because he's clearly not content right now, be it with the losing, his contractual status, and a big part of the calculus for the Rockets and keeping him all these years, really since January 2021, and the rebuild was obvious. It wasn't just his 3-and-D, and now his defense is not what it's been the last couple of years for some of the effort issues that you've been talking about. But part of his value equation has also been his influence on the younger guys that you're trying to develop, and that he's so valued in the locker room. And I think back to after the trade deadline last year when they didn't move him. Kevin Porter Jr. had some really moving words about how important that EG was to those guys in their development. And at the time, it was very easy to say, okay, maybe this is why they're not trading him for a late first-round pick or whatever it is that they're being offered, which isn't that much in the grand scheme when we're talking about assets in the rebuild. But now he's not even providing the usual intangibles because clearly there's something off here. You can see it not just in his effort, but also the interviews, which I think are very uncharacteristic. That's not Eric Gordon to go out of his way to say, really, of the entire team, there's no improvement. Earlier in that week, it went beneath the radar, but when the Rockets were in Chicago, he did a shoot-around interview with Jonathan Fagan, and Fagan asked him, did he want to be here? Did he want a trade? And Gordon replied, I direct all of those questions to Rafael, basically saying no comment. And that was unusually blunt from Eric as well. So I think you're just going to have to address it one way or another, because I don't think that if you just keep him and do nothing with his contract, then there's a lot less value to that, because he's clearly not giving you what he's given the last couple of years in terms of the intangible values, leadership, being a good teammate, because he is frustrated on multiple levels with what's going on. And, you can make the case for an extension at a lower AAV. I won't say that there's nothing to that, but at the same time, he's also 34 years old now, and you've got a lot of other guard/wing prospects you're needing to develop. I think even if you do that, you'd want him to probably come off the bench, especially if you bring James Harden back. And Tim McMahon has reported that there could be a link there, that the Rockets keep Gordon. It could be a perk to James Harden, who obviously loves EG. They played together all those years when James was in Houston. And so if you keep Eric Gordon, maybe it helps you with your offseason pursuit of James Harden if you want to go down that road. But even if that's the case, I struggle to see how you can keep Eric Gordon entering his age 35 season as a starter at the 3, especially with some of the rebounding issues, which that's not just this year. That's been going on for a while. And just overall the amount of young prospects that the Rockets have to develop. I just struggle to see that a 30 minutes per game Eric Gordon is the way. Now, could you talk me into a 20 to 25 minutes per game off the bench? Yeah, you could. But then at that point, we're asking him not just to take a lower AAV, but a reduced role as well. That's a lot to ask. What I think is that it's just a bit simpler to simply trade him now. And even if you can't get the first round pick you did a year ago, I don't think it's that big of a loss for Rafael Stone if you get a couple of seconds or one high second, whatever. You get one pick in the 30s instead of a pick in the 20s last year in what was a weak draft. What does that really matter in the grand scheme? I don't see that as something that's worthy of getting worked up about. And if you do want Eric Gordon back, then even if you trade him, you could also sign Gordon with whatever leftover money you have this summer after you sign Harden, hypothetically. It's not like you wouldn't have an avenue to potentially bring him back anyway, because he would be entering free agency, barring an extension. So I just don't really see the need, unless he's giving you a super friendly AAV figure that's a lot less than the 20 he's currently set to make, and B is also making it clear that he's willing to take a lesser role if the team determines that to be warranted. And again, they need to play KJ Martin more. They also need to find room for Jayshawn Tate, who's apparently on the verge of returning. So I just don't understand why that would be the way to go, unless he's willing to give you those assurances. And that just seems a whole lot to ask. I think the cleaner route is to ship him off to a contender for a second round pick. It probably won't be what you would have gotten a year ago, but whatever, at the end of the day, I don't think that's all that big of a deal. And then if he does fit with James Harden, if you do want to make it work, then you can look at bringing him back in the offseason and have those same conversations then. Because I feel pretty confident that you would not be trading Eric Gordon against his will. It's not like if you trade him now, he's going to be upset because, he wasn't allowed to stay in Houston. No, if anything, he would say thank you, because I think his feelings on this are pretty clear. So I wouldn't rule out an extension or guaranteeing his option for next year or something like that. But to me, the much cleaner fit is to trade him and worry about the rest later.
Yeah, I think it would clearly, they probably won't get a first round pick for him. I would say. I think most of the reports were probably leveraged, or first round picks that come with conditions on taking on extra salary or something like that. I wanted to mention just a report from Kelly Iko earlier in the week where he says, given
Eco.
that Kelly Iko, sorry. Given that Gordon has no more guaranteed money after this season, he wants clarity on his situation, whether it's a long-term extension to remain in Houston or a trade to a contender. And, if Gordon's at this stage, and Kelly Iko is one of the most reliable reporters for the Rockets, if he's at this stage, you might as well trade him. It's clearly, a loss for Stone, who could have traded him earlier. But even if you decided to keep him on a lower AAV, to me, there's two problems about it. First of all is, even if James Harden's coming in, the more, non-contractual requests he has when it comes to bringing players in or trading for players, the better for me. Because I don't want him to feel like this is going to be back in the old days where James Harden controlled everything. So the more limits you impose on that, the better for me. And then if you extended him even at a lower AAV, to even if it was to come off the bench, which is already a little bit of a stretch, he'd likely be playing the six-man role. And if most people want to bring in James Harden or Scoot Henderson or a starting, true point guard of some sort, then KPJ is supposed to be the one who slides back to that role off the bench.
Right.
And I would say that KPJ is one of the few bright spots on the team. Moving on to a different trend that's coming into the halfway point of the season. KPJ has improved his efficiency a lot. He has limited his turnovers a lot. Those are two of the biggest concerns with him. He's been taking more catch and shoot threes, which are his strength, and that's reflecting on his efficiency numbers. Over the past 6 games, he's shooting 50, 40, 75 splits, scoring 22 points a game. And even more importantly than that, 7 assists to only 2.7 turnovers. Right? Those are huge deals when it comes to KPJ's development. And it comes from him playing a lesser role to some extent, or playing a different role. And that's exactly the role you'd want to slot him into if you brought in a quote-unquote starting point guard to play over him. He'd be playing, against more second units, which is something that he's been doing. The Rockets have been doing a better job of staggering him and having him face, worse players.
Yeah, and one of the things about KPJ's recent surge, if you go back to the end of November, he's basically at 58 in terms of his true shooting percentage, which is well above average. And it's come at a time that the Rockets as a whole have just plummeted in terms of their net offensive rating. They were number 17 in the league in November. In December and January to this point, they're dead last. For the season as a whole, they're second to last. And that's really concerning when you look at this roster because, number one, they really haven't had that many injuries. The one guy that's been consistently out is Jae'Sean Tate, but he's not someone that's that important to you on the offensive end of the court. And when you look at the way this team has been constructed, Stephen Silas as a head coach is someone who, when he was hired from Dallas, was known for his offense. That was where he had pedigree. The questions about Stephen were on the defensive side of the court. So you made an offensive hire at head coach. In terms of your most talented prospects, you've got KPJ, Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, Jabari Smith Jr. Of those 4, 3 are clearly tilted towards offense, Jabari really being the only defense-first guy. And so with all of those questions, or with all of those, I should say, perks on the offensive end of the floor and questions defensively, you would like to think that offense is the one area that entering year 3 for Stephen Silas and his second year with all of these guys, we heard throughout the offseason how they were all in the gym together and about the benefits of chemistry and continuity. You would like to think that you would see a jump on that. Not a huge jump, but at least going from maybe 30 to the 20 to 25 range, like we talked about with Matt Moore in our episode with him prior to the season. Some progress, at least in the context of rebuilding teams. We haven't seen that. And what makes KPJ's recent run of form all the more remarkable is that the Rockets as a whole are struggling this much, even with KPJ really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Just imagine if KPJ wasn't doing that, how brutal the offensive numbers would be. And of course, that speaks to some of the issues with, I think, most notably Jalen Green, who struggled a bit on that end of the floor. Well, he struggled on both ends, let's be honest. But I think the defensive end, given his frame, we expect that at 20 years old. It's the inconsistent offense that's a bit more troubling. But yeah, KPJ has done a lot of heavy lifting on a team that's not giving him much in the way of support either. And in terms of some of the assist to turnover numbers, look, I'm not going to say he's a perfect point guard, but these guys are not making threes. There's a lot of potential shots that, quite frankly, could be assists that just aren't because this team is so ice cold. And again, that goes back really to the last week of November. It's just been a slog for the last few weeks to watch this basketball team. And it does tie into, I think, some of the issues we were saying earlier with Steven, and why I am very curious to see what would happen if they were to move on and install John Lucas as the interim. I've noticed there's a segment of Rockets Twitter that's resistant to that because the odds are that John Lucas is not going to be your coach next year. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but he's a guy who's in his mid-60s age-wise. He's probably not the guy you hire in the offseason when I think regardless of whether Steven is fired or not, the bottom line is that this is the last guaranteed year of his contract. So I expect them to do really a full canvas of the league, barring an absolute miracle by Steven over the second half of this season. And I think the odds are the Rockets have a new coach next season, and it's not going to be Steven or John Lucas. So with that in mind, there's some people that I've noticed on Rockets Twitter that say, well, why make the move then? If it's just for John Lucas and you're not trying out, one of the younger coaches on your staff, or perhaps looking externally during the season, the way the Timberwolves did with Chris Finch a couple of years ago, if you're not doing that, then what is it worth? Why are you sort of holding Steven Silas accountable by making a public spectacle if he were to be let go when it's not like you're getting the guy for your future anyway? And my response to that, and it ties in, I think, with KPJ as well, there is value in seeing how players on this roster respond to a different voice. Now, that's not saying that you should make a change at head coach just for the fun of it. Obviously, that's very difficult on an organization, the team. A lot of things would shift if that were to happen. You don't do it willy-nilly just as an experiment. With that said, if you reach a point, and I think we could be getting close to where the Rockets conclude that, hey, Steven Silas is not going to be our guy after this season, we know we're going to have to make this move in the next few months regardless, then there is some value in potentially installing John Lucas, even if he's just an interim and he's not your long-term coach. Then you can also see how players like Kevin Porter Jr. respond to a different voice. Some of it can be effort related. Some of it can be tactical in terms of the schemes employed by a different coach. But I just think that even if you're not giving coaching reps, which I know isn't a thing, but I think, I'm trying to address some of the concerns that are out there, at least on Rockets Twitter. Even if you're not giving coaching reps, there's value in using a big chunk of your season, one that's about development and experiments anyway. You're trying to learn about a lot of these younger players as we get close to this summer with up to $60 million in cap room, and some of them could be replaced by players who sign with that cap room. I think there's a lot of value in potentially seeing how guys like KPJ and Jalen respond to a different voice, offensively, defensively. Even if that voice, in this case, Lucas, isn't the guy who's your head coach a year from now, there's value in simply being able to determine, hey, how much of this issue is on KPJ and Jalen, and how much of this is potentially fixable with a different coaching style, with a different voice in their ear, someone that's willing to be the bad cop in John Lucas's case. To me, that argument is just very overplayed. This idea that, well, unless you are ready to turn over the keys to your next coach, then you shouldn't do anything because basically it's just more trouble than it's worth in terms of the transition process. To me, there's a lot of value in seeing how a guy like KPJ, and we're still trying to find his optimal role long term, and the same can be said with Jalen in year 2, Alperen Sengun trying to sort of figure out where he fits into this, and also can they overcome some of his defensive limitations, not being a rim protector. There's potential value in seeing how they respond and knowing that data to a different leadership style, a different tactician, even if it's not the tactician you use next season. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and to me, it falls down a little bit to this. You're already not the worst, but tied for the worst team in the league. It can't really get much worse. Silas is supposed to be the offensive genius. Well, you're already 30th in the league. Defensively, I would argue that John Lucas will probably be an upgrade. And so what are you really losing, right? It's not like one of those things where you're weighing it in and you're like, okay, if we fire Silas, we're losing this, and that we'd rather have until the end of the season. I can't at this point really recognize anything that would fit that criteria. And so bringing in John Lucas to me increases accountability, which at the worst case scenario, accountability is something that's really important, especially for a team that's going to be trying to win right next season. So just from that perspective, it makes sense. And like you said, different players respond to different coaching different ways. And this could be in John Lucas, in my opinion, I'm obviously not there to know, seems like the polar opposite of what Stephen Silas is as a head coach. And so that might help you choose your head coach for next season as well. Are you going to look for the more hard-nosed guy if Lucas has success? Are you going to look for more of a tactician if John Lucas doesn't have the success and he looks even worse than it is with Stephen Silas? You know, it's not uncommon for players to change teams and look like completely different players, and their weaknesses are not nearly as glaring, and their strength look a lot more important. Just a change of coaching, just a change of scenery might help that, and from maybe a little bit of a mentality reset standpoint, because this team just seems like it's just out of sorts right now. And I think another angle to approach, if Lucas were the one to take over as interim head coach, that would be a nice way to reward him. I think he joined the Rockets in 2016 as a development coach, and he's been here for a long time. I mean, he was a candidate along with Stephen Silas back when Silas was hired.
Right. In 2020, when the final three were Jeff Van Gundy, Stephen Silas, and John Lucas, and ultimately Silas was the choice, it would have been very easy for Lucas after there were points in that process where people acted like he was the favorite. That logic was definitely out there. And for him to sort of swallow his pride and work on the staff of the guy that, during that 2020 process, they were basically on equal footing, and for him to come and basically work as his assistant, yeah, that showed a decent bit of humility and, being a good soldier for the organization. You're exactly right on that.
Yeah, and so it makes sense to give him another shot. I don't think he's been a head coach since the early 2000s. So just see what he has, and worst case scenario, at least you're bringing in some accountability, which is going to be important to, first of all, lose a little bit of the bad habits that we're creating, especially defensively, and second of all, to just as I said, just see how different players react to different types of coaching. I would like to ask you a question about this, because I myself don't know, and I've seen some people bring this up. If John Lucas was made head coach, right, for the rest of the season, two things. Does that mean like a new contract where he's paid like a head coach? And second of all, does that mean that, in all likelihood, if he's not the head coach for next season, he has to be fired or move on to another team? Because it'd be a shame, but the selfish part of me thinks it'd be a shame to lose him as an assistant coach for half a season of head coaching.
So there wouldn't be a dramatically different contract. I suspect they would find a way to give him some type of bonus, but assuming he has the interim tag, it would be a short-term deal. They would not be giving him any sort of long-term commitment. So based on that, basically his contract would be in place. Maybe they would give him a temporary raise or bonus, however you want to do it, because yeah, sure, it's definitely more responsibility. You would have the option of keeping him, but honestly, I think some of it, and I agree with you, it would be a shame for him to go. He's fantastic with those of us in the media. He's a great representative of the organization around the league, so respected by players. I think he's definitely an asset. But I think the Rockets, in the shape that they're in, if he's not the guy, and you don't want to rule it out, he is even older than I thought. I said mid-60s. He's actually 69, and he'll be 70 later this year. So he's basically D'Antoni's age from when Mike was with the Rockets a few years ago. But it's not impossible. Again, D'Antoni has been interviewing for head coaching jobs, and so if he does a really good job, then sure, I'm sure he'll throw his hat in the ring. And while I still wouldn't think he's a favorite in that scenario, it's not implausible. But yeah, his contract will basically be the status quo going into the offseason, and so a new coach would have the option to keep him. But I do think that the Rockets, it's going to be important for them to give whoever they hire, assuming it's not Lucas, the autonomy to bring in his own staff. And hopefully, based on the relationships and the respect that Lucas has around the league, that he could be an option for that coach. I think it's definitely possible, and John has great relationships around the entire organization, so I'm sure people in the front office would try to nudge that coach in that direction. But I do think that with the Rockets having so many issues right now, there is a lot of talent, but there's also a lot of work to do for the next coach, assuming that there is a change. Then I don't think the Rockets want to go into negotiations saying, well, you've got to have this guy on your staff and preferably as lead assistant. No, I think to draw the right candidate, you're going to have to give them the autonomy to pick their staff, to bring in their guys. I do think there's a world where John Lucas ends up being one of them. It's happened that way before, sort of like an arranged marriage, because Lucas, it's not just what he's doing now. He's also basically a culture guy for the entire organization, a great representative. So I suspect it'd be better than 50-50 that it does work out. But I just think from a political standpoint, for the Rockets to be desirable to this veteran tier of head coaches, if they want someone proven like a Quinn Snyder or Terry Stotts, I saw the poll that you did on Twitter a few days ago, then you're probably going to have to at least give them the freedom to say during the process, hey, if you take this job, you can bring in your staff, and then just try to subtly nudge them in the Lucas direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's just because, as you said, I think John Lucas is an asset. I think he's someone with a lot of life experience. He can really get to these guys. The Rockets are likely not going to be, in reclamation project mode for much longer. So it's not even from that perspective, but just his ability to relate to the players, his ability to hold people accountable. I want to reiterate this. I loved his energy on the sidelines last game. I'm not sure how good or bad it would be for his health if he were a head coach of this team in specific, given how frustrated he gets with some of these mistakes. But I wanted to move on to maybe a little bit of a different topic. I think, and I've been kind of toying with this idea for a long time, but Alperen Sengun is something, and his situation with Houston is something that needs sorting out. I understand using him as a pick and roll player, and he's done fairly well at that. Because if he is to be, a center on a good team, he's going to need to be able to play the pick and roll, because even Joel Embiid needs to be able to play the pick and roll, and he's one of the best post centers in the league. But at the same time, and John Lucas does this a little bit more. He did last game. We need to start using Alperen Sengun as a shot creator and on his strengths as well. And this is regardless of what you think of him. If you think he's not a part of the future, this is also the correct way, the correct approach, and I'll explain it. If you think that he's, here for the future, and if you think he's the center of the future, barring a Wembanyama, and even he and Wemby might work next to each other on a front court, just because Jabari Smith is so switchable. If you think he's the center of the future, you need to develop that, because a lot of people say, well, let him just work on his weaknesses. He's not the perfect post player. There is development to be made there, right? The more matchups he faces, the more we'll realize that this guy he's not unstoppable. He's really good, especially for his age, but he's not going to be unstoppable. We saw him have trouble with Mitchell Robinson, for example. So even he has ways to improve, even as an on-ball player, as a post-up player. So we need to develop that for the future. We need to develop the chemistry with him as a post player, with the other guys, because playing around the post player involves a lot of off-ball movement, which this team kind of struggles with. So there's chemistry you need to build there, not just pick and roll chemistry with Jalen Green and KPJ. If you don't think that he's your center for the future, if you're too, and I know some people on Twitter are like this as well, if you worry about his defense, if you don't think that he'll eventually become good enough as to being your starting center on a competitive team, which is rare. Only Sabonis and Jokic are doing that at a competitive level within, Sengun's archetype of sorts. Then running the offense through him is still the correct path to take. And why do I say this? He's starting this season. He's playing more minutes this season than he did last season. And he's one of the only players on higher volume than he was last season that has also increased his efficiency and just his numbers across the board, except for assists, which looked exactly the same as they were last season with less minutes. I suspect that the assists would go up if you were used as a hub more, because you can do some short roll passing, right? But you're not going to get as many chances to do so as you would if you were the hub. Besides, this team has done really poor shooting, so maybe his potential assists are looking better than they did last year. But even if you don't think he's the fit long term, by running the offense through him, knowing that he is maintained efficiency, he's up from 55% last season to 61% this season on true shooting, that will increase his value as well. Sengun is such a productive player that if you ran through him, I don't think you'd have much trouble getting him to be a 20 and 10 player, a 20, 10 and 3 player this season right now as a 20-year-old. And you might think that those stats don't translate to winning because you have doubts about his defense. But if you have those doubts, then he's not going to be here for long. So you might as well inflate his trade value and use him as the core piece in a trade for a star. If you are of that stance that you don't think he can be built around because of his defense, that doesn't mean you should neglect him and let him, lose value as an asset. That should mean that you'd be proactive in, capitalizing on someone who looks like a potential star. And even if it's not the type of star that you envision building your team around, someone else will see, especially with the rise of the Kings with Sabonis this year and how good Jokic has been, someone will see value in it. I'm really not exaggerating when I say 20, 10, and 4 is on at least average true shooting is not out of reach for Sengun if they run the offense through him. And imagine how much value he would have as a 20-year-old averaging 20, 10, and 4 or close to it on a trade for a star. That would be one of the more valuable young players in the league. And you have someone who I truly think is capable of putting up those numbers, and you're just limiting him to a role that just doesn't fit him whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I want to reiterate, I understand that it's important for him to play pick and roll. Any center in the league has to play pick and roll. But it doesn't have to be, an 8 or an 80. You can be like a 45. You can do some pick and roll stuff and a lot more post-up stuff than what you're doing. If nothing else, even if you forget all of the theory crafting that I just did, if nothing else, because it will make the team play better. And we all know a more functional team contributes to development.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it's just the obvious lever that you can pull. Because as I said earlier, what concerns me most at the halfway point of the season is actually the offense. The defense is very frustrating, but you can make a case with how they're constructed and how young they are that some of these issues will just improve with time. Lots of young teams are really bad defensively. It's the offensive end of the court with all the talent they've drafted and a head coach that's supposed to have a lot of expertise on that side of the ball to be that bad. Again, second last for the season, dead last since the start of December. It's really, really troubling. And I don't know what other lever they can pull to fundamentally shift this offense on the fly and experiment and try something different. Because even if you want to boil it down to a Kevin Porter Jr. not being a point guard issue, it's not like there's really an internal option to do anything different. And I also don't think that Jalen Green is someone that you want to scale up his usage even more because, again, just the little bit of scaling up that they've done this season, it hasn't gone all that well. His true shooting percentage, Jalen's that is, has gone down from nearly 55% last year to barely above 53% this year. So he's struggling, even though the raw numbers are there, averaging about 21 points a game. The efficiency is not. So I don't think running more offense through Jalen is necessarily the answer in year 2 at 20 years old. The only guy that's actually being somewhat efficient that you could reasonably scale up to a bigger role is Sengun. So when you look at how you can change things internally prior to, the offseason, making some sort of impact trade or free agency signing, something like that, and making your roster filled with more veterans, in terms of better optimizing what you have now, and clearly offense is the end of the court that I think is most concerning in the macro, then I know it's easy to say it's sort of like play through Sengun. There's a faction of Rockets Twitter that says that literally every game. So I'm sure some are sort of tired of hearing that. But at the same time, at this point, it's literally all you can do, as I see it, because, again, I don't want to pile on Jalen because it's just year 2 and he's only 20 years old. And it's not like there's no progress. Again, he is getting to the free throw line nearly 6 times a game this year. And that's definitely, a tick in the right direction. So he's close to doubled his free throw attempts per game. He's getting more aggressive on his drives. In the last couple of months, I believe he's been closer to 7. So there is progress being made. It's not nothing, but in my opinion, Sengun is the only reasonable lever that you can pull to really at least potentially shift things, because I just don't think that Jalen, based on what we've seen, is ready for that. Where are you at on him and how Jalen potentially fits into that? And perhaps I should also point out that if you run more through Sengun, maybe you get the ball to Jalen Green in different spots. You encourage more off-ball movement, something that gets him going in different ways. But I just think that, when we talked about KPJ, we talked about Sengun, and Jalen is the other guy that offensively can take on a bigger role. but I just don't think he's ready for that. And I think that plays into perhaps this idea that you need to do everything you can to optimize Sengun, because right now, midway through his second season, Jalen just isn't that guy.
No, yeah, I agree completely. That was exactly the segue I was going to make. Jalen's just been worse on bigger volume, and his game has shifted this season. He's not playing off the ball nearly as much. And I know this is going to sound hypocritical because last season I kept asking for him to get more on-ball reps. Getting more on-ball reps doesn't mean not having off-ball reps. It should be, with a guy as talented as Jalen is, it should be maybe a 60-40 split where 60 is on the ball and 40 is off the ball. Or, okay, let me rephrase that. It's not 60% of the total possessions of the game where he's on the ball and 40 where he's off the ball. It's within the possessions where you're going to use him, whether that is having him on the ball running pick and roll or having him coming off of screens into either attacking a closeout, cutting, or popping for a three-point shot. Within Jalen's usage, 60-40, right? Mm-hmm. It's not been like that, and playing through Sengun very much helps that. Itamar brought an interesting point up last night about Jalen Green's decision making and how it was a concern during the draft cycle. We have seen Jalen Green improve as a playmaker when it comes to after creating the advantage, making the right pass. I'm not arguing that, but making the correct decision in the first place in what to attack with the ball in his hands is still very much an issue. We see him have mismatches and still call for screens. We see him have mismatches and pass the ball to someone else. We see him try to shoot over bigs instead of trying to pull past them when they're playing up on him. He has all the tools. He should be ready to be a better offensive player than he is now, and I think a lot of it comes from decision making. And that's one of the tough things about developing a young scoring guard is that you need the correct structure around him to tell him what to do and to develop him the right way, because it's very easy to turn someone who's very gifted at scoring into just a chucker. It's really easy. It's really easy to turn into Jordan Clarkson. That's why you need the correct structure behind them, and that's why when we talk about coaching staff and we talk about the entire structure behind the team, and people say, "Oh, that's just micro stuff." Yes, it is micro stuff. But there's some micro stuff that becomes really important, and how you develop Jalen Green, what you tell him to do on the court, the mentality you're trying to instill in him, not just defensively. I mean, even offensively. And this is not just as I said, collapsing the defense and making the extra pass instead of forcing up a shot. No, I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about, even his mentality scoring wise. You need to be very careful with what you do with it. And so that's why, sometimes that micro stuff scales into micro stuff. Mm-hmm. Jalen Green is the most important player on this franchise, barring drafting Scoot Henderson or Wembanyama next draft. And
right.
Just from a little bit more of a macro perspective, since we've been running a little bit long, from a macro perspective, these things add up, and the franchise isn't doomed. We have a lot of talented young players, and it's still not too late. It might be too late to accomplish a timeline that they've been trying to sell people on when it comes to just being competitive next season. It might be a little bit too late for that. But that isn't the end of the world. Even if you give a good pick to the Thunder, that's not the end of the world. You still have a lot of young players to develop. But at the same time, we need to become better. And next draft, we might be talking about this. In next draft, you get Wemby or Scoot, and all of these micro questions just are swept under the rug, and it doesn't matter anymore because you're just going to out-talent other teams into winning games. That's a possibility. Yeah. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to do the best job you possibly can, and you shouldn't be, paying attention to the micro stuff right now as well, because getting one of those two, and even if someone else from that draft, becomes a clear, generational talent from now until the end of the draft cycle, it's not guaranteed that you're going to get one of those guys. So investing in what you have is extremely important.
Yeah. So let's wrap up by talking about what we want to see in the second half of this season, because we've spent so many recent episodes talking about obviously the James Harden pursuit, Victor and Scoot, talking about what's to come this offseason and the years ahead. But there is a lot of value in this year, even amid the losing, because, of course, you want to develop these types of young prospects that we've been talking about in the right ways. And, of course, the team collectively, 10-28 as we're recording this Thursday morning, identical to a year ago, on pace. They're not quite at the halfway point yet, but if they lose their next three, they'll be on pace for 20 wins the same way they got 20 wins a year ago. And I think that's, well below their over-under number going into the year, which was somewhere between 23.5 and 25.5. So certainly collectively, there's some things that are going wrong, and not even within the confines of rebuilding is this all normal. Again, they are underachieving even some of the low expectations that we had going in. Now, it's not all bad. You could, by being one of the three worst teams, especially if you're the worst, maximize your lottery odds and give you a floor of pick 5 in what should be a very strong draft in 2023. So there are some benefits from a tanking perspective, but in terms of actually developing these guys internally, yes, there's some concerning things. And so as we go to the second half of the season, again, I do think that a few more wins will accompany some of these trends, but it's not the primary goal. The primary goal is just developing these prospects in the right way. And my goal for the second half of the year is simply to get more data, to experiment more, because this team has been remarkably stable when you consider all of these problems. There are coaches around the NBA that will adjust based on a bad game or two. Whereas with this group, and again, if we're recording this, they've lost 10 of 11. They still use basically the same starting lineup and rotation, other than, they did recently put Ty Washington in over Daishen Nix, which in my opinion was long overdue, but let's give them credit. They did do it. The starting lineup is still basically the same. They do occasionally start KJ Martin over Eric Gordon when it's, the second night of a back-to-back, which will be the case tonight. But it's been a remarkably stable rotation and starting lineup for a team that needs to be using a season like this to experiment. And that's why I mentioned earlier, talking about the potential benefits of John Lucas over Steven Silas. Get some more data, see how some of these players potentially play if there's a change. Now, I'm not saying they have to make that change. Steven can do some things himself. Maybe start KJ Martin over Eric Gordon. I know that's a bit more tricky because KJ has not made threes at the clip that we would like him to, at least not from his first couple of years when he was at 36%. But that's an option that could give you more size, athleticism, rebounding potential with your starting lineup, more physicality. We talked about using Sengun as a hub and basically trying to simplify the game for KPJ and especially Jalen, and perhaps maximize Sengun's trade value as well. Even if he's not the guy, well, if he starts putting up 20 and 10 and 4 or 5 assists, then he's going to look attractive and can help you in a potential star package down the line. There's a lot of ways that you can go about it. But the bottom line is, whether it's Steven, whether it's John, we need to use this season to get data. That's the way I think the Rockets should be approaching this organizationally. There's still time. Again, we're not even quite to the halfway point. But to this point, the data they've collected has all been within a certain box. And I think even if it doesn't improve the result, there is value in trying out different boxes and see how certain players respond to that. Oh, does this player play better in this grouping when he's surrounded by these guys? Does he play better if he gets more touches, if he's getting to certain spots, if the offense is running through Sengun instead of KPJ? There's all sorts of hypotheticals that we can go through. But the bottom line is the data that they've collected to this point, again, it's not useless. And the good news, they have been relatively healthy. But I do think that there's value in getting data collected in other ways as well. And that's something that needs to be a priority the second half of this season. Maybe the return of Jae'Sean Tate will help, because I think he's definitely one of the better passers and facilitators on this team, and he should help them defensively as well. I do wonder what's going to happen with the rotation, especially with Eric Gordon still on the roster, no EG trade yet. I think that's a fair question, but maybe it's a good thing in that the return of Tate sort of forces them out of their comfort zone, which it's weird to call it a comfort zone given how much they're struggling at the moment. But I think it does seem like that they are very rigid with how they use certain guys, the patterns, the rotations, the starting lineup. And I would just love to break that, because in a season that's about not just development, but it's also about, from an organizational perspective, learning, seeing what you have in these guys. Let's see what you have in different context as well. Because again, in a season which you're not getting the wins, it's all about getting another high draft pick. You need to learn. And I think over the second half of the season, there's ways that they can learn more about these guys that they have not done yet.
My list is quite long, so I'll run through it fairly quickly. First of all, I'm tired of seeing a 3-center rotation. That's just not a thing NBA teams do. And it's not like we're playing 3 centers and we sometimes play 2 of them together. No, we're literally splitting the 48 minutes of a center rotation across 3 players. That doesn't work. Bruno Fernando might even be a useful player next season if you can't get a pick and roll big and you need one. But Alperen Sengun and Usman Garuba need to be the priorities, and they need to get those minutes. That's one of the first problems I have. I want to see more Tari Eason, which will be tough with Jason Tate coming back, which brings me to Eric Gordon's got to go. I know I brought up as a question whether we should extend him or not. I don't think we should extend him. I think it's just, at the state that he's at now, I'm not sure even, extending him would cause enough of a mental reset for him to all of a sudden be caring enough, especially to get 30 minutes a night, which is completely insane in a rebuilding team. There's parallels to this. You can go to the Magic and look at how much Terrence Ross is playing, for example. Besides that, I would like to see 2 things. First of all, more Tariq in combination with Jabari Smith. There's players for some reason on this team that we rarely see playing together. And Tari and Jabari are 2 of those players. For some reason, it just basically never happens. I want to see them try to run a little bit more offense through Jabari. And I know they've been doing that a little bit more lately. They've been more recognizing mismatches that Jabari gets a lot more. They used them to counter a zone a couple of games ago, and he went off in the first quarter, and then they didn't go to him again for the rest of the game. That's another thing that needs to change. If we've got a player that's playing well, keep feeding him. Let's see how far he can take us that game. Let's not this part just as a fan. One of the most exciting things about as a fan is when one of your young players pops off in the first half, and you're like, oh my god, how many is he going to get in the second half? And if you ask most fans on Twitter, they're just like, oh, I'm not even that excited because dude's probably not going to touch the ball for the rest of the game. And that's what happened with Jabari, during that game. Sengun usage, as you mentioned, as a post-up, we need to see more of that. And something I'm looking forward to, especially if Silas is gone, is accountability. I think even if the play on the court offensively doesn't get better, it's important to be accountable. Even from a fan perspective, just watching the games, one of the funnest games of the season was the win against Milwaukee, and that game was not that impressive from an offensive standpoint. KPJ had a okay game. Only Jalen reached 30 points on good efficiency. That was good, but other than him, KPJ had 18, and then everybody had less than 10. Jabari Smith was extremely cold offensively. He was 1 for 9. But he had a stat line of 6 points, 10 rebounds, 3 steals, 1 block, and he was holding Giannis for a good portion of that game. If the defense is going to be this bad, at least become a scrappy team and then try to stay in the game through your defense. Another thing that one of the last points that I'll bring up is Garrison Matthews. He's an okay player and he has a role. He's probably one of the most likely Rockets to have a role on a good team if he were on a good team. But I just don't think it's and a lot of people disagree with me when I say this, but I just don't think he is good for development. I think his archetype is definitely something that has a role on better teams, a sharpshooter, but there's levels to what a sharpshooter is, and I think Garrison Matthews goes way over the top with the shots he takes. I know he's still efficient, mostly because he only takes threes, layups, and draws fouls a lot. That's why his shooting is so high. His 3-point percentage is actually not that good. But the shots he takes are basically just, early in the shot clock, kind of, they make your offense look better than it actually is. And if I know it might be, thinking too far ahead, but if this team was to make the playoffs, Garrison Matthews likely doesn't play. The Miami Heat have Duncan Robinson earning near $20 million a year, and he doesn't play in the playoffs. These guys, the guys like Duncan Robinson, Davis Bertans, consistently don't play in the playoffs exactly because of that, because they're flawed players that are only worth it to kind of ease the load during the regular season where teams aren't specifically targeting you and game planning for you. So Carson Matthews, they should keep him. I don't think they should waive him. I think there's a usage for him when this team's finally good during the regular season, but I just can't justify him playing as much as he does, and he doesn't play a lot, and the type of shots that he takes just aren't great. Then last couple of things, we keep hearing to begin seasons that we want to play fast, that we want to take advantage of our youth and athleticism, and we try to do it by crashing the boards and playing transition defense, which is not working, by the way. We play terrible transition defense. I could make a whole point about that, but please let's stop bringing the ball up, taking 8 seconds to bring the ball across the half-court line. We spent nearly half of our offensive half-court possessions just bringing the ball up. That's really not acceptable. That doesn't keep the defense on their toes. One of the reasons why we can't generate easy shots is because we're stagnant. We don't put pressure on the defense even with the simplest things, that like demanding that the other team actually run back in transition even off of made baskets. People always bring up that we're not a great transition team because we don't cause a lot of turnovers. You can still bring the ball up a lot quicker than you do. And I know it's a small thing, but it kind of triggers me. And the last thing, please let's stop doing two things that really trigger me. We do dribble handoffs to oblivion without creating any advantage out of them. Mm-hmm. Even when we create a mismatch, we don't capitalize on it. So what's the point? Why are we constantly running the ball across the perimeter, running dribble handoffs that don't get us anywhere? And the second one is just from a sets standpoint. It's terrible to see how many times we run pick and pop with complete non-shooters. Bruno Fernando is as much of a non-shooter as you'll ever find. And you see possession after possession after possession when he's on the floor, where he sets a screen and he pops back up out to the three-point line. And I don't know if it was Silas that said this, but usually when he does that, they very quickly run another dribble handoff. But once again, you're not really creating any advantages out of the dribble handoff. And a pick and pop is not it doesn't generate you enough of an advantage for you to be able to transition that into a dribble handoff and still have an advantage. By the time you run the dribble handoff, the advantage is gone. A pick and pop creates you a small window for a good shooter, and only good shooting bigs do this. That's why. Only creates you a small window where you're open to take the shot. It doesn't make sense. There's way too many things on our offense that don't make sense, but that's one of the most triggering ones, because you guys know I'm not the biggest X's and O's guy, but fundamental offensive principles are not that hard to understand, and that just really doesn't make sense.
Yeah. First week of 2023, and Paolo's resolution list for the Rockets, be it Steven Silas, John Lucas, whoever it is, boy, Paolo's resolution list is probably going to take a lot more than 1 year, man.
Yeah, for sure. I was just going off the top of my head. Most of them won't get fixed, but if you get 2 or 3 of them, they'll be
sure.
great.
And it makes sense. Target areas of improvement. That's the best way to put it. Let's use the buzzword improvement that Eric Gordon shows. But yes, this is something they should be talking about. You're not going to fix all of these things, but even if you fix just a couple of them, then okay, that puts you in a better spot entering this summer, and especially entering the fall, when you're hopefully going to be trying to win, and you want these guys to shed some of the losing habits that they definitely picked up over the last couple of years. The rot of losing, you led off referencing that, and I think that's a good point to end on. You may not shed that in terms of wins and losses the second half of this season. This team is what it is from a talent perspective, age, etc. But perhaps you can at least fix some of those habits. That would be a good place to start entering next season, or entering the offseason, and of course transitioning to 2023 to 2024 when the Rockets are actually trying to win games. With that, we'll bring this episode to a close. For Paolo, I'm Ben. We thank you guys so much for listening. If you want more content from us before our next show in a week or so, then, of course, you can follow us on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. The show is at The Logger Line, and Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA. Also, if you go to our aforementioned The Logger Line Twitter page, you can find our link tree, which is where you can find information about our partners and sponsors at Karbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire. You can access their websites and info, enjoy their content, and of course you can also find our various distributors, be it Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you want to listen to this podcast. You should be able to find a lot of them from that link tree. That's our best reference, and again, you can find that on the Twitter page at The Logger Line. With that, we will close out. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening to another episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. We'll be back soon with more.